The scene, Princeton University, graduation 1929. The student voted most likely to succeed, John D. Rockefeller III. Obviously, his fellow classmates had a sense of humor. At the time, the Rockefeller family fortune was estimated at $1 billion. In fact, young Rockefeller's grandfather was called the world's first billionaire. He was called a lot of other things, too. Perhaps no other American family has been so severely criticized for the way they made their fortune or so lavishly praised for the way they have spent it. This is their story. Join us now as Biography presents The Rockefellers.
Have you seen the well-to-do
Thank you,
up and down Park Avenue on that famous thoroughfare with their noses in the air?
John D. Rockefeller, I believe, was America's first billionaire.
He had to have it all, and to get it all, he moved beyond the law.
I do not believe that great-grandfather went beyond the law, but he certainly flexed his muscles.
He became the kind of lightning rod for all the things that were wrong with industrial development.
Rockefeller. Once, the name meant ruthlessness and oil. Later, public service and philanthropy on a grand scale, from Yosemite National Park to the United Nations. What has never changed is what the family name has always evoked: wealth and power.
Money is like sex, power, lust. It's appetite, and it can destroy. I mean, that's what's unique about the Rockefellers. That money was painful legacy for them, but it never destroyed really any of them.
Oil. Instant, fantastic wealth. Black gold making millionaires out of paupers, the true American dream. But before 1859, getting at it was a problem. That's when Colonel Edwin Drake drilled a well in northwestern Pennsylvania and showed where it was and how to reach it. Since kerosene from the oil revolutionized the way America lit its houses, the nation was soon in the middle of a gigantic oil boom. The new chance for fortune made wildcatters of the most unlikely of men. With a little capital, anyone could strike it rich, and thousands tried.
In Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania in the 1850s, bubbling crude was almost literally coming up from the ground. You could get into the business of crude oil production by buying a farm and drilling a well and striking oil.
And it was a frontier life in the Pennsylvania oil towns, a rough and tumble existence in a land of mud and muck and mire. If oil promised the riches to bring a better life, its price was some of the hardest living conditions imaginable. There was nothing subtle about the towns that sprang up. They had names like Oil Creek and Pit Hole, which grew to 15,000 people in 2 months' time. The magazine The Nation said of Pit Hole, "It is safe to assert that there is more vile liquor drunk in this town than in any of its size in the world."
An oil town was a very rowdy place to be from. It was dirty. Oil was flowing in the streets, also very muddy. There were planks for sidewalks. It was about as rough and uncomfortable an atmosphere as one can imagine.
In spite of the hard life, the fortune seekers just kept pouring in. But as the oil from any deposit was drained, the land could go from priceless to worthless overnight. One Pit Hole farm sold for $2 million in 1865, and just 13 years later for $4.37. And oil prices fluctuated wildly because of the inevitable overproduction.
Oil was everywhere. It was on the roads. It was slopping around. It was kind of in the air almost, and it was a kind of element that was just waiting to be controlled by somebody.
The man who would impose that control and make himself a billionaire in the process was John Davison Rockefeller. He was born in this house in upstate New York in 1839. Eliza Davison, his mother, was a fiercely sober Baptist, determined to instill the values of order and piety in her children. Her husband, William Avery, was something else entirely. He was a small-time con artist with a variety of schemes to make money off his countrymen, including a treatment guaranteed to cure cancer. Not the least of his trickeries was his secret life as the husband of another woman, Margaret Livingston. Whether or not John ever knew just what his father was up to, he knew the devastating impact of his father's ways and was bent on being different.
think that John D. Sr. was always reacting, till the last day of his 90-plus years, was reacting against his father. The father was wild, uncontrolled emotion to him. And John D. Rockefeller wanted to put lightning in a bottle. He wanted to control things. He wanted to rationalize them.
It was John D.'s sense of order that produced Ledger A, his minutely detailed account of every penny spent in his childhood. Here was the money made, the money saved, and the money spent, including the 10% he always gave to the church. If religious piety could be brought to the secular world of accounting, it would look like Ledger A.
The amounts of money that he was dealing with there were to be calculated in pennies and dimes. It was a very small amount of money. And the reason for doing this is that if you have to write it down and see it and you have to account for it, it helps you recognize the value of money.
And so Ledger A was a kind of comprehensive sort of record of his inner life, except it has no thoughts, it has no emotions, it has figures. And that's kind of at the core, in a sense, of his character, the inner John D. It's a kind of a severe accountant's mentality.
In 1855, the 16-year-old John D. moved to Cleveland, then becoming a major railroad and commercial hub. It was as an accountant that he began his professional life.
When he went to Cleveland as a young man, his father told him that it really wasn't important for him to go to college. He wanted to go to college, and his father said, no, it would be much better if he went to a trade school, because then he'd learn something useful, where he could earn a living. And so, in fact, he learned to become an accountant.
He joined the firm of Hewitt and Tuttle, but when he was refused a raise, he started his own company selling produce. Trade generated by the Civil War and the opening of the West made a success of this first venture. Rockefeller's business personality was now set.
His friends called him the Deacon. He was a kind of pious and also very serious and stern, sober figure. People would ask him, what are you going to be when you grow up? And he'd always answer, never with a profession. He'd say, I'm going to make $100,000.
As oil boomed, Rockefeller realized that this was the field for him. In 1865, he went into a partnership with an experienced oil refiner, the Englishman Samuel Andrews. Refining oil made more sense to Rockefeller than drilling for it. Wells dried up, but every driller needed a refinery.
The amount of capital needed to go into the refining business in, say, 1862 was very small. I mean, you essentially set up a small still in your backyard and you were in the refining business. John D. Rockefeller nevertheless believed that it's important to be big.
And the company got very big. Rockefeller understood that the bigger the company, the cheaper its costs, the greater its profits. And he grew big through attention to detail. For example, to save money, the company began to make its own oil barrels. And then Rockefeller discovered a way to save even more.
You can imagine the kind of efficiency that somebody who had done something with his life like Ledger A would bring to an enterprise. One of the things he did, he would go around and see the people soldering the oil barrels, and he found that they were putting 40 drops of solder in. And he said to one guy, he said, will you please try 38? And the guy tried it, it didn't work, but 39 did. 39 was perfect. Later on in his life, he would recall this, John D. Rockefeller, and he'd say, a fortune we saved, a fortune. What he was concerned with was not the fortune he made, but the fortune he saved.
The company grew by buying up refineries. And the bottom line grew further through a range of oil byproducts. Rockefeller would see nothing of the refining process wasted. John D. Rockefeller formed Standard Oil in 1870, and from delivery to storage, wherever middlemen had operated before, Standard stepped in. Of course, as he put it, we made a fine crop of enemies by it too, but we made oil far lower in price than it had ever been before. By the late 1870s, John D. Rockefeller was a millionaire many times over. Rockefeller's most important deals were with the railroads that took his oil to market. He represented such a large volume of business that he was able to force them to pay rebates.
From the beginning, John D. Rockefeller saw that he had a kind of common partner in the railroads. The railroads had an interest in this oil running smoothly, being produced and refined smoothly, so that it didn't come in dribs and drabs and unpredictably. And so he made an arrangement that would profit him and really help destroy the competition. And one of the things he got for himself were rebates. That is, for every barrel of oil shipped, he got a certain number of dollars back off the shipping fee because of the volume that he was shipping. And his competitors, these small competitors, didn't get that. And then he made a further step in the economics of strangulation in coming up with the railroads with this concept of the drawback.
The drawback system was a kind of extortion. The railroads had to pay Rockefeller a percentage of the shipping fees his competitors were paying them. It was illegal, of course, but no railroad dared object.
And what this obviously did is it made it more difficult for competitors to use the same railroad. It's a way not just of getting the best price yourself, but frustrating the competition.
By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled 95% of the refining business. Rockefeller's reputation for being ruthless now spread as wide as his corporation. His business practices were legal, like swallowing up competitors, questionable, like spying on them, and illegal, like the drawbacks. And anyone with the guts to compete could count on a visit from Standard to discuss a buyout.
He would have his people evaluate the worth of their properties, issue stock that matched his evaluation of what their properties are worth, and they could take it or leave it. So he would print a piece of paper that said, here's 100 shares of Standard Oil. You are now a junior partner in a company of which I am a senior partner. I may never declare a dividend, and you can't sell this to anybody.
He did buy out, and in some cases force out of business other people. But when he did that, he would offer them either cash or Standard Oil stock.
Did he give them any choice? Sure, you didn't have to take his stock, but if you didn't take his stock, your oil, he could show you, was going to cost more to refine than his because his was the biggest refinery in town.
He said, I always offered them stock in Standard Oil. And if they turned that down, that was their mistake. And of course, technically, he was correct, because Standard Oil went on to be this, huge thing, and they would have all been millionaires. He created endless numbers of millionaires. But he didn't go to the other side of it, that is, if they didn't accept the stock, then he put them out of business. He just bought them out.
In his private life, meanwhile, he had married the strong-willed Laura Spellman in 1864, and they'd had 3 daughters in quick succession. But it was their 4th child, John D. Jr., born in 1874, who Rockefeller hoped would one day take over the firm. Despite his Puritanism, Rockefeller bought a large home on Cleveland's fashionable Euclid Avenue. And he built a 700-acre country estate, Forest Hill, which he characteristically hoped would someday turn a profit as a hotel. He even surprised at least one business associate with a bill after a visit, but eventually accepted the notion of the nonprofit home. But he never lost his deep commitment to religion. He had been a trustee of the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church since the age of 18. Nor did Rockefeller ever see a conflict between his faith in God and his faith in monopoly capitalism. The good Lord gave me my money, he would say, and the future promised ever more benevolence from above. 26 Broadway, New York City. John D. Rockefeller moved his Standard Oil headquarters here in 1882 to be at the center of what was becoming a global enterprise. In time, it would become the most famous business address in the world. New York in the 1880s was a city of old money and new wealth. Society was dominated by the likes of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, but John D., worth over $250 million by the middle of the decade, lived as simply here as he had in Cleveland. He even took the elevated train to the office and joined none of the businessmen's clubs. Instead, the family enjoyed a quiet and pious home life at the modest townhouse they built on unfashionable 54th Street. Laura Spellman and John D. had in common a deep commitment to righteous behavior. Her family home had been a stop on the Underground Railway, and John himself had once paid for a black woman's freedom.
There was a fierce sense of right and wrong in both my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. It was not so much a matter of some kind of a public statement, of just a personal commitment, and probably not thought to be all that heroic, just something that you ought to do because it was right.
One of the most remarkable things that grandfather did was to establish Spelman College, which is college for black women in Atlanta. And he did this back in the 1880s, before people were interested either in blacks or in women. They may have been interested in women in a different way, but not in the way that they are today.
And now that his wealth was growing, he could express his righteousness by giving freely, and he poured millions into the Rockefeller Institute, making it one of the world's premier institutions of medical research. And in 1889, he donated $600,000 to endow the University of Chicago. Over the next 10 years, he would give $45 million to the school. Inevitably, his motives for such huge gifts were suspect.
It was important for him to be righteous and to be seen to be righteous. I think that this was an attempt to control his fate, to make a bargain with the Lord. That if he did the right thing with his nickels and dimes and pennies, perhaps in the great beyond, the Lord would be good to him.
Sometimes people have said that the only reason that he gave lots of money away was because he was trying to atone for what he had done in earning a lot of money through Standard Oil. He felt a sense of responsibility to use it intelligently, but the notion that he was trying to atone for something that he felt he had done that was wrong just is not true.
As it happened, it really didn't matter how much money he gave away. His nearly total control of the vital oil industry made him the perfect embodiment of capitalism gone mad. There was scarcely any disagreeable creature with which Rockefeller was not compared in the political cartoons of the era.
Everybody thought that John D. Rockefeller was impervious to this criticism he was taking. I mean, he was the most hated man in America, certainly, perhaps the most hated man in the world. His name was synonymous with ruthlessness. And it was assumed that he was just kind of this steely facade. But inside, of course, it was taking its toll.
He suffered digestive problems, and in 1901 he contracted alopecia, a total loss of body hair that can be congenital or a nervous disorder. Whether it was the public outcry that took his hair, his sense of order dictated a series of wigs of different lengths to emulate natural hair growth. If Rockefeller was already the object of vilification, Ida Tarbell only made matters worse. In articles for McClure's magazine that began in 1902, the noted muckraker depicted his company's tactics as cutthroat and his character as a portrait in greed. But America needed little convincing that the power of men like Rockefeller was way out of hand.
I think the public concern about big business and the reaction to Standard Oil and to Rockefeller that was caused by that concern was really due to a feeling of loss of control. When we change from a small business and agricultural society to a society in which many people are employed by a big company, we give up a lot of control over our own destiny. And people felt out of control. That was one reason people feared big business. So I think that that concern is part of what made people so angry at Rockefeller.
The president, Teddy Roosevelt, was the point man in the effort to bring Rockefeller down. In spite of his own privileged upbringing, Roosevelt was an enemy of the big business trusts. He knew the nation was more than ready to rein them in, and so he decided to go after one of the biggest of them all, Standard Oil, and its director, John D. Rockefeller.
He became the kind of lightning rod for all the things that were wrong with industrial development.
In 1909, the Supreme Court turned to the Sherman Antitrust Act to bring Standard Oil down. Breaking up so enormous a company so pervasive in American life would be a monumental task.
I think that at the time, the Standard Oil decision was viewed as a real blow to Standard Oil and a victory for the public. And I think that that view was a misperception.
The breakup formed a group of smaller but still powerful companies dominant in their regions. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Esso, now Exxon. Standard of Ohio became Sohio. Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Standard of New York became Mobil. Standard of California became Chevron. And Continental Oil became Conoco. All in all, 34 different companies were created out of Standard Oil, and John D. had a piece of every one of them.
He didn't fight it. They kind of made a joke about it afterwards. He sent out to all his lieutenants a kind of fake obituary saying, oh, that this thing is passed on and we must mourn its passing and that sort of thing, but it was a kind of catty and sarcastic and not very serious response.
What Sr. had to take seriously was the new way America would light its homes.
All this oil that Rockefeller was refining, he was refining basically into kerosene. And then comes Thomas Edison, who has a vision. I mean, he wants to change the way illumination takes place in homes, in businesses, and factories. And he succeeds in doing this by coming up with the electric light. And really, just by luck, the dominant design in auto manufacture at the turn of the century turns out to be the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine is fueled by gasoline. Gasoline is refined from petroleum. So just as he is losing the core market that he has, another market, at least as great, comes along, and the business keeps growing.
The wholesale transformation of America into a nation on wheels would make Rockefeller the richest man in the world.
It is said that he was worth between $850 and $950 million in 1911. The gross national product that year was about $35 billion. So think of somebody being worth 1/35th or 1/40th of the U.S. GNP.
But Rockefeller's reputation among his countrymen was only declining as his millions increased. He had become so despised that he finally decided to do something about it. And so he hired the patrician Southerner Ivy Lee to reverse his public image. An early master of public relations, Lee used the media, which the muckrakers had used to disgrace Rockefeller, to turn him into a sympathetic figure. Ivy Lee recognized early the power of the new moving picture and used newsreels to show a remarkably benevolent Rockefeller.
I am very grateful to you and to a host of people who are so kind and good to me all the time.
Why? Because you're so good to everybody.
Yes, you are.
As Ivy Lee began to kind of control his public image, he became oddly a kind of American character. And people kind of warmed to him in a bizarre sort of way. It was like having Frankenstein on the loose walking around New York City or something like that, with a cane and a long hat.
Although this plane never takes off, this photo opportunity was presented as Senior's first flight. Perhaps Ivy Lee's most brilliant public relations move was the casting of Rockefeller as the man who gave out dimes.
Don't you give a dime, Mr. Rockefeller? Oh, please. Go ahead. Give it a dime.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I consider myself...
Thank you for the ride.
I consider myself more than amply paid.
Bless you, bless you,
Yes.
bless you.
And here he was viewed as a very wealthy man and viewed with a certain amount of awe. And if he gave children a dime, it gave him a chance to say a few words to them. It was really a means of quick communication, and it was very effective.
He handed out some 30,000 dimes, these shiny new dimes. Having a Rockefeller dime was like having a Mickey Mantle 1955 baseball card. I mean, it was a kind of collector's item. It was touched by Midas.
The name Rockefeller soon came to mean the richest and the best. To all the world, this austere Baptist was now a society swell.
Now if you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where fashion sits? Putting on the Ritz. Different types who wear a day coat, pants with stripes and cutaway coat, perfect fits. Putting on the Ritz. Dressed up like $1 million trooper, trying hard to look like Gary Cooper. Super duper, come let's mix where Rockefellers walk with sticks or umbrellas in their mitts. Putting on the Ritz.
He devoted his final years to his golf game and handed over his business affairs to his son, John Jr. But if only in his later years John D. Sr. set out to change his reputation, his son would make the polishing of the Rockefeller name his life's work. John Davison Rockefeller Jr. was born in Cleveland on January 29, 1874. His childhood was one of wealth and loneliness. His only playmates were the gatekeeper's son and his three sisters, who referred to him as the Crown Prince. And in spite of his privileges, his father's deep piety dictated for the shy boy a life of relative austerity. In childhood, the boy gained from his father a lifelong love of nature, but in most ways, he was his mother Laura's son.
He had her virtues, you know, extremely pious, extremely religious, extremely conscious about criticism, and very much a kind of psychologically frail creature.
Father was brought up in very strict Baptist atmosphere and was not allowed to do anything on Sunday except read the Bible and take a walk and go to church.
John D. Sr. insisted that his son learn thriftiness at a young age, and so required him to keep a ledger, just like the one he himself had kept so many years before. Junior's intricate log detailed every penny earned, spent, or given away. Some of the small transactions now seem laughable when measured against the monumental wealth of the family. Junior could have attended Yale, but he thought the crowd there a little fast, so instead he went to Brown. With his frugal ways, he managed the football team into solvency, but his endless thriftiness gained him the reputation on campus of an eccentric, the son of a millionaire who went so far as to mend his own dish towels. In an unusual step, he attended a college dance where he met Abby Aldrich, the daughter of a prominent Rhode Island senator.
He had met Mother at a dance, which is interesting because his mother didn't really approve of his going to dances, but he did anyway, and finally persuaded her, I think, that it was good exercise or something, so that she finally gave in.
I think from the onset, John D. Jr. saw that Abby Aldrich was really the woman for him. She was everything he wasn't. She was cultured, she was socially graceful, all these things that the still kind of rough-hewn Rockefellers hadn't acquired yet.
They were very different people, and as reserved as my grandfather was, so much in the opposite direction was my grandmother unreserved. And I think that that was the glory of that marriage.
Abby's independence shone early in the marriage. To his suggestion that now she keep a detailed ledger of all expenses, she gave an unqualified no. On graduation in 1897, Junior went to work for his father in New York. Known at the firm as Mr. Junior, but with no specific job, his ambiguous status corroded their relationship.
My impression of it was one of struggle off camera. It had a lot of contention which was dealt with out of the public eye and maybe a lot out of the family eye.
He, being the only son, was given enormous responsibilities at a very young age. Really, the moment he graduated from college. And he had very little guidance. He was put on many of the boards that his father had been on and put in a position of making judgments and decisions around the corporate world that he had no feel for, no innate skill for. It also was a world that his father had exceeded so grandly in that there was no room for him.
Junior's growing discomfort at Standard Oil ended in a nervous breakdown in 1904. He went to France for 6 months. On his return, he announced that he would give up his work at the firm and devote the rest of his life to philanthropy.
John D. Sr. had said, "God gave me my money." For John D. Rockefeller Jr., it was a little different. His father, who was a kind of God to him, gave him his money. But it carried the same kind of theological charge. Go and do good with this money and do God's work.
There was, of course, no shortage of God's work that needed to be done, and no shortage of Rockefeller money to do it with. From fighting juvenile delinquency and prostitution to prison reform, the range of causes was breathtaking. In the arena of education alone, Junior gave $42 million in 1905 to raise teacher salaries in poor areas. He was as scientific in his philanthropy as his father had been in business. Abby and Junior had 6 children between 1903 and 1915. Abby, known as Babs, John D. III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and the youngest, David. The children spent a great deal of time at one of the 5 Rockefeller estates, Pocantico Hills, the very private 3,500-acre home on the Hudson River established by John D. Sr. From Georgian manor house to manicured gardens, Pocantico was a 3-dimensional expression of the quiet opulence that characterized the family. To one observer, it was an example of what God could have done if only he'd had the money.
We have on the place at Pocantico something that's called a playhouse. It was built by my parents for my generation. I think the term playhouse, if you see it, is surprising to most people because it's very big.
It is in the playhouse, built for the Rockefeller children, that one finds the swimming pool, the bowling alley, and the fireplace overlooking the indoor tennis court. Such symbols of wealth did not, however, make the children's upbringing any less strict and pious than that of their father.
My grandfather and my grandmother were very good parents, but particularly my grandfather was a very stern parent. They passed on very Baptist values. Prayers in the morning, prayers at lunch, prayers at night.
As if in some grand duchy of old, the Rockefeller children lived in virtual seclusion from the outside world, unaware of public perceptions of the family. When young Nelson was sailing his toy boat one day, a boy reportedly asked him, "Where is your yacht?" "What do you think I am?" he replied, "a Vanderbilt?" When Junior had wanted to free himself of the ugly life of the business world, he could find no better place to do it than Pocantico. The cosseted life here made the rest of the world seem unreal. But before long, the outside world impinged on this sanctuary noisily and irrevocably. In 1913, 2,000 miles west of Pocantico in the coal fields of Colorado, a bitter labor struggle was brewing between the powerful Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and its workers. Colorado Fuel and Iron happened to be one of the few companies on whose board Junior still served. The life of a miner working for the company in one of its drab little mining towns like Ludlow was straight out of Dickens.
If you were a miner in Ludlow in 1913, you were trapped in a misery hadn't been seen in America until the advent of industrialization. It was kind of a wage slave mentality and existence. You'd be making $1.60 a day. You'd be spending it in company script. You'd be living in exorbitantly priced company housing. Your children would be ill-educated in company school. And you would be tyrannized over by company thugs.
He was on the board of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, and he and grandfather were by far the largest investors. I think they had something like 30% of the stock. They had a very important say in what was going on.
The United Mine Workers were trying to unionize the company against the fierce opposition of its managers. The company hired vicious private enforcers to intimidate the unionizers. Most of the workforce walked off the job and set up a tent city nearby. Escalating confrontations ended with the deaths of 2 women and 11 children killed when their tent caught fire. The furious retaliation of the miners led President Wilson to mobilize federal troops. In the ensuing battles, 75 miners were killed in what would become forever known as the Ludlow Massacre. The outrage was national. This was a public relations disaster for the Rockefellers. Junior knew he'd have to take radical action to undo the damage to the family's reputation, and he was prepared to discard his father's policies in the process. In a brilliant move suggested by his advisors, Junior went to Ludlow, where he talked with the miners and danced with their wives.
They went out, and Father spent 2 weeks visiting all of the camps. He would go and meet with anyone who wanted to see him, whether it was in washrooms or in the workplace, or he would go where they had dances and he would dance with their wives. It was really a very courageous thing for him to have done because it was not something he was accustomed to.
The old clumsiness was gone. Junior charmed the miners and he brought improvements to the conditions in the mines, but there'd still be no union in Ludlow. John D. Sr. was so impressed with the way his son had handled the crisis that he transferred to him control of all Rockefeller business in 1914. The next 60 years would change the family's name forever.
That's it.
It's 1930, and the 90-year-old John D. Rockefeller Sr. has long ago left the management of Standard Oil. Now the family's wealth is from 1,000 different investments, but Sr. still takes the opportunity to read a letter of thanks to the employees of Standard on its 60th birthday.
I have no words to express my appreciation of all who have had a part in making the company the success it has been, far beyond our fondest dreams at the time of its beginning.
The wealth that Sr. himself had by now amassed was far beyond his fondest dreams. And in his final years, in his role of retired magnate, he could be seen leading a Baptist hymn.
Yes, we'll all sing, Mr. Rockefeller.
Shall I go?
All right.
Passing
boy, passing boy.
Or playing the Pocantico 18. He'd hoped to make it to 100, but died 3 years shy of that on May 23, 1937.
That's fine. You're a good song leader, Mr. Rockefeller. That's good.
With the passing of this last great symbol of unfettered American capitalism, an era had closed. The full weight of the Rockefeller name now fell on the shoulders of John D. Jr. His father had made a fortune of nearly $1 billion, and the son would spend the rest of his life giving that much money away.
My grandfather finally decided to become the person who would translate the making of money into the giving of money. And I think he felt a responsibility to make sure that not just his father's name, but that the family name be seen in context. I think he wanted to be right with the public. And I think he got right with the public.
One enormous contribution was in conservation, a field he long loved. He bought up the entire Jackson Hole Valley of Wyoming and donated it to the new National Park Service. For Junior, giving back to the nation that had been so good to him was a fundamental principle.
Without certain principles, life has little meaning. I believe that every right implies a responsibility, every opportunity an obligation.
Saving the redwoods of California was another of the conservation projects he undertook after 1924. He purchased in whole or in part Acadia National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Yosemite, and Yellowstone National Park.
And he believed that every plant and every rock and every tree and every flower had spirit in it. He wanted people to experience the natural world, and he felt those things were a manifestation of the divine as he understood it.
And at the height of the Depression, he began a project back in New York that was wildly out of step with the battered economy, Rockefeller Center.
He saw this was an opportunity to do something that would be seen as an act of faith in the darkest time in American history. And indeed, Rockefeller Center is saying America is going to revive, America is going to dominate, America is going to prevail.
We are all determined that our economic machine shall work. There is a very close relationship between our national state of mind and our general economic status.
I think he took an enormous personal pride that he put tens of thousands of people to work. He wandered all over that project for years with his famous ruler, measuring everything in sight, looking at everything.
Of all their holdings, Rockefeller Center would become the crown jewel, employing thousands, making millions. Over on the east side, at his son Nelson's urging, Junior bought and then donated land for the new United Nations in 1946. His actions brought a prestigious institution to the city, and since the land was going to be developed anyway, he eliminated the site as a potential rival to Rockefeller Center at the same time. His stature in the public's eye made him an important ally of any national effort. Here, he volunteered to promote an FBI campaign to fingerprint all Americans. Abby's interests turned more to the artistic.
They were very, very distinct, both in their personalities and the things that they cared about. Grandmother cared passionately about modern art, and grandfather could have done without it.
she just went out to his absolute horror and started something called the Museum of Modern Art with a couple of other very rich ladies.
It became known in the family as Mother's Museum, and in spite of his reservations, Junior eventually contributed millions of dollars toward its support. But the project he adored above all others was the restoration of the small town in Virginia that became colonial Williamsburg.
Williamsburg was an act of pure love on his part, to be able to take a part of our history and restore it and make it available to the American people. I think that was an act of never-ending joy. It probably was the thing he loved most about his whole life, was doing Williamsburg year after year after year.
In many ways, he was a person who was cut off from life, and so I think when he had opportunities, as with Williamsburg, to be engaged in a project, I almost imagined him laying the bricks somehow.
The Rockefellers so loved Williamsburg, they spent at least 2 months a year here in their home at Bassett Hall for the rest of their lives. In 1948, Abby Rockefeller died of a stroke. She was 73. And Junior himself died in 1960 at the age of 86.
The death of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. at Tucson, Arizona, brings a life of wise philanthropy to an end.
The extraordinary philanthropist. That's how the press and public remembered him at his passing. It was proof that in the 42 years since the Ludlow massacre, he had made the transformation of the Rockefeller name complete. John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s children carried on the process of tying the family's name to good works.
The degree to which John D. Jr. had succeeded in his life task, which was to cleanse the oil, as it were, the guilt off the family name, was seen in the way these children were regarded. They were regarded as young princes coming out of this family with tremendous expectations for them.
Eldest child Abby continued her mother's work with the Museum of Modern Art and became a major funder of cancer research. The oldest son, John D. III, devoted his life to the issue of population control, started the Asia Society, and created Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York City. Nelson became a 4-term governor of New York, ran for president, and served as vice president of the United States. Lawrence carried on his father's conservation efforts besides establishing a series of luxury resorts. Winthrop became a 2-term governor of Arkansas, the first Republican in the State House since the Civil War. And David became an international statesman as well as the president of Chase Manhattan Bank. And even with all their public giving, the family continued to prosper. Its net worth is now estimated to be more than $5.5 billion.
Bless you. Bless the Standard Oil.
Thank you very much.
No other family in America has come close to establishing the fame, power, and influence of the Rockefellers. They exemplify the American dream, the idea that anyone can start with nothing and build a great fortune. And they've shown their gratitude by giving much of that fortune back to the country that made it all possible. Their generosity has left an indelible mark on the American landscape.